Hello everybody and welcome to this week's JavaScript lecture. We are going to start with chapter 10. This week we have chapters 10 and 11 for this week's content. So chapter 10 is all about forms and data validation. And we have seen forms before in this course. They've been in a lot of applications that we've been working with, but now we want to focus in on creating our own forms and being able to do that. So in our HTML, using the form element, setting up all of the attributes we need accordingly. So the action attribute being what where the request, the HTTP request gets sent to, and what HTTP method to use, whether that's GET or POST. And then using various input types. So we've seen the text type for text boxes. We have also seen buttons used as well in forms. And specifically, when you put type equals submit as your type attribute on an input element, that will make it so that by default, when that button is clicked, the default event is to submit the form. So here are some common types of input controls here. And for any of these input types, you can also use these attributes. So if you set up an input element in your HTML file, you can specify the type. So we saw in the last example, we had some text types and we had the submit type for a submit button, but there's also a wide range of input data that you can do, that you can use, and they have their own validation already baked into them, so you don't have to write JavaScript code to validate those necessarily. And then the autofocus and placeholder attributes. So they are attributes that you can add on as one of your many attributes that you have in your input element opening tag. So type is one attribute, and in that type is where you could put, for example, one of these. But another attribute you could use is autofocus. If you want the browser to set the focus to that element when the page is loaded. And this is just a Boolean attribute. So if you want an element to have the focus automatically, all you have to do is put this attribute inside of your opening tag for your element. You don't need to put an equal sign after it and anything in quotes. Since it's a Boolean, it's just, it is true if it's there. You just have to put it in there. And then the placeholder attribute, you do have to give it a string, and that attribute will put whatever is in quotes inside of that element, whether it's a text box or whatever it is. That text will show up, but it won't actually be in the value of the element. So as soon as the user clicks into that text box, it will become an empty text box for them to be able to type in values. And your textbook gives some more examples of attributes that you can use, that you can put inside of your opening tag for an input element. But these are geared towards data validation. So, for example, the required tag, that will indicate that a value is required, so it will make sure that, if they click the submit button, it will not actually submit the form and notify the user that that field is a required field. They have to enter something in there for them to be able to submit the form. And the required attribute and the no validate attribute are both Boolean attributes like autofocus. So if you want to add those into your input tag, you just have to put, required or autofocus or no validate there. But the others, title, pattern, and autocomplete, you do have to put an equals and then something in quotes after them. Your textbook also introduces some CSS3 pseudo classes that you can use to format some of these fields. So if you want your input fields that are required to be displayed differently, then in your CSS file, you could do something like input : required, and then have your CSS properties that you would like to apply specifically to all of your required input fields. And similarly, you can do the same thing with your valid and invalid fields. So that will be depending on your data validation attributes you have. That will determine whether or not the individual fields are deemed valid or invalid. So those controls and attributes that we just went over are all HTML5. So they are baked into HTML5. They automatically do those kinds of data validations for you. But there are some disadvantages to using those rather than just writing your own validation. So if you use those, you are gambling a little bit because different browsers handle HTML5 input controls slightly differently. Most of the major ones, it will be pretty standard, but it's not a guarantee that you will have the exact same functionality across all browsers. And the HTML5 input controls for validation are limited in what they're able to do. So if you want a little bit more intricate or a little bit more complex data validation, like if you want to look at the values of two text boxes, like an email address and confirm email address fields, to check those values and make sure that they're the same, that is complex enough that there isn't anything in HTML5 that can do that for you. You would need to use JavaScript in that case. So it's nice to know these and be able to use them when there isn't much validation you need to do. But if there is some more intricate validation that you'd like to do for your forms, you pretty much have to use JavaScript to do that. So let's talk about using JavaScript and jQuery to validate values in your form when it's submitted. So we have seen data validation with forms already. You've written some JavaScript code to check the values that are in input fields and, check to see if there are errors. Do you need to display those errors to the user, or is everything valid? Can we go ahead and submit the form? But jQuery has a bunch of selectors that can make getting those fields a lot easier. So there is a big long list in your textbook for some selectors for getting form controls. So for example, you can use the checkbox selector to get all of the checkboxes. So it just makes it a little bit simpler to write those $ functions to select what you need to select in order to do the checks that you need to do. And then once you've selected the elements that you want to take a look at to validate some values, now you can actually take a look at those values. So once you have an element that you want to look at what the value is, you can use the val method to get that value, to see what is actually there in that field. And if you need to, you can also set the value to whatever you'd like it to be. And then there's also this trim method, which for a text-based input element, that will remove all of the spaces at the beginning and end of a string. So, for example, like an email address, a user might accidentally type the space bar at the end, and you might want to just preemptively make sure you're trimming off all of this potential spaces that a user might have accidentally entered at the beginning or the end of that text field. And so this will just take care of that for you. Now let's talk about events that you may come across with forms. So obviously the submit event, when a submit button on a form is clicked, that is an event that's going to exist for pretty much any form, but you might also want to handle when a certain element gets the focus or loses the focus, or if a value is changed, or if the user selects text in a text box or text area. And keep in mind that for all of these, they are methods, so they happen on an element. So to use one of these to set up an event handler in your code, you would want to have a $ function selecting the element that you want to set up the event handler for, and then you can put your dot and then say, I'll do the submit event method. So this will set up an event handler. So what I need to put in parentheses is that actual event handler, that actual function. So for example, I could do an anonymous function like this, and then have code inside of here. But there are also just methods that trigger these events. So for these, you just have to select what you want to trigger the event on, and then put, your dot notation, and then your method. And these ones do not take any parameters. So they're set up exactly the same, but the event methods set up an event handler for a element. So they need to be passed in an actual event handler, an actual function. Whereas if you don't plug in anything as a parameter, that will just trigger that event. So let's go over an example before we move into chapter 11. So this is the example in your textbook the validation application. So before we jump into the code, let's just take a look at what this looks like. So we have this form with a bunch of fields here, and we can see that there are some placeholders here in password. Let me zoom in a little bit. For password, it says at least 6 characters, but if I click into this field, that actually stays there. But I think at least when I start typing, yeah, it should disappear. And then we have some radio buttons, and we can also see as we click on these radio buttons, depending on what one is selected, this company name field is disabled or enabled, because if it's an individual membership type, you don't need a company name, but if it's a corporate membership, they want to know the company name. And then we have both a submit and a reset button. So let's go back to the code. So in our HTML file, we have our headers and our title, and then we have our form element that encompasses pretty much the entire HTML file. And our action attribute is the page that we are going to navigate to and send the HTTP request to, which is this register.html. So when the form is submitted, it will go to this page, which just says your account registration has been submitted and then gives the information. And then the method for what HTTP command it will send with is the get method. So we will see if we actually submit the form, and we can do that right now real quick. If we actually submit it, and let me do something that will actually work. Okay. And so when we use the get method, all of the information that we entered will show up in the URL. So we typed in a@gmail.com. That's the password and the verify password fields that I typed in. We selected the individual and then first name A, last name A, phone number, all 6s. So you may or may not want to use the get method. Usually not if they're entering in password information, because it will just show up in the URL, so anybody looking at their browser can just see that. So a post method might be more suitable if you are having the user enter in a password. All right. And then we have all of our input elements. So we have text elements for the email address, for the password, verifying the password. And in our second group, we have the membership type, so those radio buttons. We have the company name, and we can see by default the individual radio button is checked, so that is selected. So also by default, the company name field is disabled. But we'll see how the JavaScript file changes those values when a radio button is checked. And then some more text inputs for the first name, last name, and phone number. And we can see the placeholder here for phone number. And there should, yep, the placeholder for password says at least 6 characters. So we saw that as well. And then we have our submit button and reset button. And we can also see that we are including jQuery and obviously our JavaScript file, since we have an external JavaScript file. So let's take a look at that JavaScript. So we have our when the DOM is ready event handler. And inside of that, so when the DOM is ready, we want to set up all of this. This is our entire file here. So the first thing is putting the focus inside of the first text box. So getting that email input and setting the focus. So this is triggering that event. And then the handler for the change event of the radio buttons. So we can see this jQuery selector for selecting radio buttons. If the checked or unchecked value of any of the radio buttons changes, then we want to do this. We want to get the value of what one is checked. And if the radio button that is checked is the corporate radio button, then we want to not have the company name be disabled anymore. We would want to set the disabled to false, set that attribute to false. Otherwise, if the individual is checked, then we do want to disable the company name. And then the next event is the handler for the submit button. So this is selecting the entire form and is setting up an event for submitting the form. And we are including the event in our parameters of our function, our anonymous function here, because we want to be able to prevent that default submission from happening if there is anything that is invalid. So let's go back up. So this is in your textbook, regular expressions were mentioned, but don't worry if this looks terrifying, because you don't need to understand how to write regular expressions yet. So anytime a regular expression is needed at this point, it will just be given to you. But a regular expression just sets up a pattern for how something should be formatted. So this is setting up the pattern for how an email should be entered. And for example, here, there needs to be a @ symbol, and there needs to be a dot or a period in it. So it needs to basically have something at something dot something with some more stipulations in there. And then this is going to, so when the submit button is clicked, everything is being validated. So the email is being validated. It's checking the value. It's trimming the value first to be nice to the user. But if nothing is entered, we want to tell the user that the field is required. If it doesn't match the pattern, we want to tell them it has to be a valid email address. And we are also setting this is valid to false if we run across anything that is invalid. And then validating the password entry is checking the length of the password. And if it's And this is going to, if it's invalid, this is going to set the text next to the that span element, which is, there's one after the input element everywhere in our form. So that is the text that's being set. So getting the input element, the dot next is getting the next element, which is going to be the span element, and then setting the text for that. And we can see if it is valid, we want to set that text to just be nothing. And we can see that for the email as well. Because the user might have already tried to submit it and gotten some error messages. But if they fix some things and resubmit again, we want to make sure we're getting rid of those error messages in those span elements as soon as something is valid. All right. And then so that was the password, and then there's the verify password, which has to match the first password. So that is the check that is happening there. And then the company name, we are only checking it if the disabled attribute is false. So there's that not in front of this condition here. So as long as it's not disabled, then we will check the company name, make sure it's actually there, that it's not empty, and that is the only validation for that one. And then the first name and last name are, again, just checking to make sure they're not the empty strings. And then the phone number also has a pattern, so there is a regular expression for that. So the validation is checking if it's empty, making sure that it follows the pattern, and that is all of the checks for the phone number. And then if we came across anything that was invalid, our is valid variable would be set to false. So if anything sets it to false, then we will prevent the form from being submitted. And let's go ahead and demo just a couple of the errors. So if I just go ahead and click submit, we can see these error messages pop up here. And if I change some things and submit again, here we can see our error messages have changed. The password is fine, but the verify password is not. And I can change things and see other error messages happening. I forget what I put for my password. So let me... And here we can also see the format with the checking the pattern, how that can be caught with a regular expression. And there we go. So I will post the code for that example, so if you want to have it to look at, to reference, to play around with, that you will be able to do that. All right, let's move on to Chapter 11 content. So this is all about jQuery plugins and jQuery UI widgets. So a jQuery plugin is also just a JavaScript library, like how jQuery is. So if we kind of think about it like a pyramid, things that build off of each other, JavaScript would be at the bottom. That is just, our language, the programming language. It has all of the syntax rules. It has a bunch of built-in attributes and methods that you can use. And then jQuery is a JavaScript library, so it's built on JavaScript. It's written in JavaScript that defines a bunch of helpful selectors, attributes, and methods. So as long as you import jQuery, you can use it in your own JavaScript file. And a jQuery plugin just is one step above that. So a jQuery plugin is dependent on jQuery, and it just builds off of it. It's, again, just a library that builds on jQuery and usually used for a very specialized purpose. So for doing one small thing or task in a web application. So if you want to use anything in jQuery, you have to include it in your file. JavaScript, there isn't anything special to include. If you have a JavaScript file, you can use anything that's in, the core libraries of JavaScript. But plugins, if you want to import any of those, you have to make sure that you are also including jQuery in your application so that you have a script element in your HTML that is importing jQuery before you are trying to import your plugin. So we'll see an example of that here. So at usually the bottom of your HTML file is where you'll put your script elements. So this is showing a script element that is getting just jQuery, and then after that, a script element for getting the box slider plugin. And then after that, you could put your script element for your JavaScript file. So the most popular plugins are the Lightbox plugin that sets up you can use to create a dialog that pops up with an image that the user has to click the X on to do anything else on the web page. And the box slider is a slider of multiple images. And then the cycle 2 is basically a nicely formatted slideshow. And I will go into an example of one of these, but I will post the code for all 3 of these examples so that you can take a look at them yourself on your own computer. So in your homework, it looks like you're going to be using the Cycle 2 plugin. So for an example to go over in class, I'll go ahead and do the box slider plugin. So if your pages are the same as my pages, it should be on page 329. It's the beginning of the jQuery plugins section in your textbook. There are a bunch of websites listed for various plugins, including more plugins than the 3, the Lightbox, box slider, and cycle 2. So there are more that you can go ahead and look at, and you can also just search Google for jQuery plugins, see what comes up. You kind of have to assess for yourself if it, looks like something safe to download, and things like that. So the box slider plugin, the official website for it is bxslider.com. And right on the home page, they have an example of using it. So it has dots on the bottom to signify the number of images and which one you have currently displaying, and these arrows to cycle through these images that you have embedded in your web application. So usually there will be instructions for how to include the plugin in your web application. So BoxSlider actually has a CDN, so you can just include it without downloading it, but for most plugins, you will have to download the actual code for it and then make sure it's in the same folder that your web application is in, or at least understand what path it's in. And this kind of shows this, the path to here. And this would just be a single slash if you do put it in the same folder. And you can also run a command line, various command line commands to include them. And this will kind of just install them on your machine so they're visible from certain paths. But the most common way is to just download the code and put it in your same folder. So this is what I did for the BoxSlider example, where I have my HTML, which is just index, and then these other things, the jQuery.boxslider CSS file and these folders are what was in this zip folder. So we can see in the JavaScript folder, there's the JavaScript for the BoxSlider plugin. And in images, I have some of these images for the example that are shown in the textbook for the BoxSlider example. So let's take a look at the code. So for a lot of plugins, the only code you'll have to write is in the HTML file. You don't have to do a lot of code writing because a lot of it is just in the plugin. So unless you have a bunch of other things on your web page that you want to, that you need JavaScript code for, the plugins will take care of a lot of the code writing for you because it's all built-in things. So we can see we are still including jQuery from the CDN, so we didn't download jQuery. We're just including it. But this, including the BoxSlider JavaScript, that is including, so right now this is the index.html file, and this is going in the JS folder, which is here, and then getting the jQuery.boxslider.min.js. So that is where you have to make sure that your path is what is expected to actually be able to reference the file. All right, and then this is setting up the slider with all of the images in the HTML, and then this could be put into a JavaScript file, but because it's so short, I just put it in a script element in the HTML file. because all you have to do is once the DOM is ready, you just have to set up or, declare this box slider. So taking that slider element, which was set up with this ID here that has all of these image elements, and then it's just a method that you can call and then set up all of the options that you want to set up for that slider. So if I click on the index here, we can see it automatically scrolls as well, because that was some of the options, I think. Because yeah, the auto was set to true. I think that means it will auto scroll. And captions is also set to true. So we have captions on them as well on the bottom of each image. And I can also click on these arrows to make things move faster as well. And there's also a play and pause button here too. So all of the code for all of this is inside of the code for the plugin, so you don't have to code any of this, any of these animations. That is all set up for you. And one last thing I want to mention about this example is that most websites for jQuery plugins have documentation. So this is called options for the box slider website. But if I click on this, we can see all of those options that we can include in our properties that we set up in our parameter for the box slider method. So there are more than just these that we can choose from. There's a big list of them. And it says what the default values are and what happens if you change it, what they signify, what type they are, if they're a string or a Boolean. And there's a bunch of other options here. So that's something that you can explore if you are interested in playing around with things as well. And also, depending on the site, they may also have examples of using them. So if you're worried about not having the right syntax or not using or setting up your method correctly for calling something from your plugin library, you can take a look at some examples. So here's an example, just a basic one that is calling that box slider method with some options here. All right, so that was plugins. So these libraries that you can import into your JavaScript application. And for these three examples here, I will be putting the code for these three in the module for this week. There's going to be a lot of code, example code, for you to look at. I'll try to organize it in an intuitive way in folders in this week's module, but I want it to be available to you because it can sometimes be hard looking at the documentation, what the syntax should look like exactly. So I want to make sure that you have that code to be able to look at and play around with. All right, and then lastly, I want to talk about jQuery UI. So that is also a JavaScript library. So similarly to how plugins are JavaScript libraries that are dependent on jQuery, jQuery UI is also a library that is dependent on jQuery. So if you want to include jQuery UI, make sure that you are also including jQuery right before it. And the main types of features provided by the UI library are widgets, themes, interactions, and effects. And we are mostly going to be talking about widgets in this lecture. All right, so here is how to include it. So this is just linking the style sheet for it. The UI has its own style sheet that you have to make sure that you are linking to your HTML. And then the first script element you have should just be base jQuery. And then after that, you can have your script element for jQuery UI. And again, this, we don't have an HTTPS here at the beginning because this, and also the CSS, are things that you have to download. There is not a CDN for jQuery UI. You do have to download it and have it exist in the same folder as your code. And then at the end of your HTML file, having your script element for your external JavaScript file as usual. So let's talk about actually downloading this so that you can include it in your web application. So this is the jQuery UI website. It's just jQueryui.com, very easy to remember. And you can just download the whole library if you want. For our purposes, it's not going to make too much of a difference if you just want to always download the whole thing and have that be in your folder where your HTML and your JavaScript is for your individual application. So you can just, under the quick downloads, click on the stable download to just download everything. But you can also do a custom download. And if you click on that, you can, all of these are checked by default, but you can uncheck things. So if you only want widgets, you could uncheck pretty much everything else, except for the things in this widget. Or if you know you only want the accordion widget, you could just have the accordion widget checked and everything else unchecked. And once you check and uncheck the things that you want, you can click download, and that will give you only the things that you wanted. And so the only difference between doing a custom download and just clicking on the stable download is a custom download will be smaller because you're not downloading everything, all of the functionality. And so it will be a little bit faster when you go to load your web page. It'll be faster for the browser to load because it doesn't have to load the entire UI library, just a subset of it. But again, for the purposes of our class, just understand that that is the case, but you don't have to do a custom download. You can just do a stable download. And a lot of times I will just provide you with the jQuery UI code inside the folder for something anyways. Now, the most popular UI widgets are accordion, tabs, button, dialog, and date picker. Here is an example of the accordion widget that you will experiment with in the homework for this week. And for any of the UI widgets, you can look at jQueryui.com, and under widgets, you can explore the various widgets and see how to use them. So if I click on accordion, we can see an example of what it looks like and just be able to interact with it. but we can also click on View Source here. And let me zoom in a little, maybe not that much. So we can see the HTML for this. So this is the most important thing for just being able to set something up as a widget. And in your textbook, for using a widget, it does specify having the document.ready and then putting your selector inside of that. So selecting your element that you set up to be that widget, and then using the dot notation, and then whatever the widget method is, and then if it takes any settings, putting that in there as well. And so this sets up this div element. That is what is being set up with this ID accordion. And so every div element inside of the accordion element is collapsible. And so that automatically happens because this method is taking care of all of that for us, the method that's included in the jQuery UI library. So it's very easy to use. The only really code that you generally need to write is making sure in your HTML that you have something that you can select to make as a widget, and then in your JavaScript, selecting that element and then using whatever corresponding widget method to apply all of the CSS and all of the event handlers for when things are clicked on. All of that will be set up automatically when this method is called. So I encourage you to look at the jQueryui.com website, look at the widgets that are there, kind of play around with what they do, maybe look at the HTML code that's there for how to use it, how to set up an HTML element to be one of those widgets to have that functionality. But that is it for this chapter. And so your textbook does go over specific examples for several or all of these popular widgets, and I will include that code as well. I know the code is pretty much in your textbook and it's pretty short, but in case you want to be able to run it yourself and kind of play around with it, maybe change things, experiment with it, you can do that. So I will be uploading the code for these as well as the plugins that we talked about earlier. So all of that will be in Blackboard. It's not required for you to download it all and look at it all, but just know that it's there if you want to take a look at, oh, how do I set up this widget? How do I make sure that I'm using it correctly? Then those examples will be there for you. All right, so in general, for this week, some of these learning objectives are you should be able to create your own form in HTML with various input controls like text boxes, radio buttons, check boxes, a submit button, a reset button, and you should be able to validate the data submitted in a form by using HTML5, like built-in attributes, but also just in JavaScript, which we have done this already, in the submit event handler, taking a look at the actual values that are there and validating that they are indeed valid values. And then you should be able to include jQuery plugins and jQuery UI widgets to be able to use them. And in general, you should be able to read documentation. So the documentation for a plugin or the documentation on jQueryui.com, and use that to apply to your own web application. So whether that's looking at the actual documentation of, what properties you can add, or even just taking a look at an example of how to use it and using that to apply and set up what you need to set up in your own web application. So that is it for this week's lecture. So our next due date, last week's homework number 7 is actually due on Tuesday the 29th at 11:59 p.m. And then on Sunday, November 3rd at 11:59 p.m. is when your homework number 8 is due. And if you have any questions, you can always send me an email, set up an office hours appointment, or you can use that homework help discussion as well. But that is it for this week. I hope everybody's doing well. We are really making our way through the semester here. So have a good week, everybody.